Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm going to begin actually doing the Remembrance Day, the Remembrance Month, virtual lecture series with our land acknowledgement for the County of Simcoe. So the County of Simcoe acknowledges that the land on which we gather today is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, which includes the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. We also recognize the Huron-Wendat, who occupied these lands prior to the middle of the 17th century. We embrace the enduring presence and partnership of the Indigenous peoples of this region, including the Chippewa Tri-Council First Nations, comprised of the Beausoleil First Nations, the Chippewas of Rama, and the Georgina Island First Nation. We would also like to recognize the diverse Métis and Inuit communities within our nation or region. The County of Simcoe is dedicated to honoring our Indigenous history and culture and is committed to coming together to learn, heal, and create future prosperity, respect, and understanding in all of our communities. Now, welcome everybody, as I said, to the Remembrance Month virtual lecture series. This is the first lecture series of this year, and we're going to begin with a great topic brought to us by Vivian McAlister. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction about Vivian McAlister. Vivian McAlister is an adjunct professor of history at Western University. He trained as a surgeon and practiced transplantation and trauma surgery. He was a member of the Canadian Armed Forces for 11 years, deploying to Afghanistan and Iraq and Haiti. And he was made the Officer of the Order in Canada, of the Order of Canada in 2021. He was made an Officer of the Order of Canada in 2021. So I'm going to pass it on over to Vivian, and Vivian's going to take on and start his presentation.
Meredith, thank you very much. I can't see myself, so does everything look okay? If you have any worries, please just tell me and I can modify. I'm very happy to be part of your Remembrance Month. And I think it's a very important role that the County Museum plays, not only in remembrance, but in forming and forging citizenship in our district. Oh, Meredith, we're not moving along. Let's see. There we go. So this is a period of remembrance of sacrifice, but it's also a period of reflection. And I hope that we'll do both today when we talk about John McCrae. I share some things with John McCrae, which maybe has given me a slightly different insight in that I too was a bit older when I joined the Canadian Army and deployed overseas. But unlike John McCrae, I didn't stay anything as long as he did in the First World War. Our deployments were between 2 and 6 months. But I did go many times to Afghanistan and Iraq. And the dominant injury that I dealt with were blast injuries. And this was something that harked back to the First World War, where blast injuries were what John McCrae had to deal with. And these are horrific injuries to place on any human. And during this period of remembrance, I remembered these patients that I had who were Canadian, allies in Taliban as well, and civilians from Afghanistan and Iraq that we looked after. But our topic is John McCrae and in Flanders Fields. And on December the 8th in 1915, Punch magazine, which is a humorous magazine in England, very popular at the time of the First World War, published an anonymous poem. And you can see here, it's just a short poem in the midst of other things in the magazine, between ads for an electric drill and some very lame joke about Kidderminster that none of us seem to understand today. In Flanders Fields, though, was published anonymously. John McCrae did not sign his name to it. However, his friends instantly recognized the style because it's a French rondo, which has very strict rules. It has 3 verses, first 5 lines, then 4 lines, then 6 lines. It has internal and external rhymes. And then McCrae made it even more difficult by running sentences over lines and finishing sentences in the middle of lines. And this makes it actually very difficult to read to the modern reader to get exactly the flavor that McCrae was trying to achieve. But he emphasizes things like "we are the dead" by stopping the sentence in the middle, and the torch. From failing hands, we throw the torch, again, is a sentence interrupted in the middle of the line. And McCrae wrote this as a piece of reflection. And as you know, it's become very important to all of us. You'll see the first line of the poem, he actually wrote, "In Flanders fields the poppies grow," and it's believed the editor of Punch changed the final word to blow. But those of you who know how poppies grow, they don't blow around quite like leaves. So, but this is a later copy that McCrae wrote for a friend in his handwriting, and he accidentally wrote "grow" again in the first line. But he composed the poem in Essex Farm Advanced Dressing Station, and we'll look at that. And he composed it on the 3rd of May, just after or towards the end of the Second Battle of Ypres. Now, this was the front line at that time, a very long front line between Germany and Austria and the Allies in the West. And John McCrae was at the very north, up close to in Belgium, that you can see on the map. And here's a closer up of it. And he was in between Ypres and Bozingue along the Yser Canal. And I can't quite point it out to you, but you can just see Ypres there. And just above that was where John McCrae was stationed, just behind the front line with the 1st Brigade of the Canadian Artillery. Now, this image is actually a reconnaissance photo taken from an airplane by Germans who were looking at the various places where the trenches were and where their foe was. And this picture wasn't available to us until, I think, sometime after the Second World War. But it shows Essex Farm at the lower part, where John McCrae was settled, and then just up towards the upper part of the photo, you can see in green is a label "Cemetery." So John McCrae's advanced dressing station was actually built into the bank of the canal, and it was probably some storage units underneath there, which the medical team renovated as an advanced dressing station. They probably looked after most of the casualties in the yard and front, but they were able to house some in the storage rooms before they were evacuated. But John McCrae's job was to look after the patients that were immediately injured and to arrange for their evacuation. During this particular battle, after which he wrote the poem, he had been working for 17 days and nights. That is beyond my conception. And he himself wrote that if the medical team knew that they would have had to work for 17 days and nights without stop, they would have thought it not possible. But they did so, and McCrae said, without changing their clothes and without even taking their boots off for the whole time. So they must have catnapped in those storage areas during that battle and during a lull in the casualties. Otherwise, they kept working for that entire period. So you can imagine at the time he wrote the poem, there was a lull in the battle, and he was profoundly exhausted. And this is the cemetery, a contemporary image of the cemetery that he was looking at. And you can see the improvised crosses that were later replaced in the war cemetery with proper headstones. But they initially buried everybody and tried to place wooden crosses there. And when they turned the soil, the weed poppy started to grow in the upturned soil. So this is the inspiration for the first lines of the poem, and it was composed by McCrae as he looked at the cemetery in the company of colleagues. Now, friends of his had died during that battle and colleagues, but he also had an enormous number of injuries to look after of people that he didn't know. Well, very quickly that poem became very famous, and his friends outed him as the author. The poem was used during the war for recruitment and to raise funds. Here's a poster for the Victory Bonds that's very well known. Another thing that increased the popularity of the poem was that it was very quickly set to music. Charles Ives set it to music in 1916 when the US joined the First World War. He was an avant-garde composer, and even today it's quite hard to listen to his version of In Flanders Fields. Sousa, the well-known band leader, made a version a year later. And it's believed that since then, 100 or more different versions of music set for Flanders Fields have been composed. And of course, we're all very familiar with the version that's used at the Remembrance ceremonies in Ottawa at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and sung by the Ottawa Children's Choir. And it's that after the war, the poem took on a different nuance. Now, John McCrae, at the time that the poem was actually published, which was nearly 6 months, or was 6 months or more after he had written it, he had been transferred from the field artillery to become head of medicine at the No. 3 Canadian General Hospital, staffed by members of McGill University at Boulogne in France. So just to tell you very quickly about evacuation, the advanced dressing station rendered first aid, evacuated the patients to the next level of care, which was the stationary hospital closer to the front line. And then they would go from there to the general hospital or directly to England for definitive care and recovery. Some of the patients would come back to Canada if recovery was prolonged. Most of them, however, stayed in England and returned to the fight if they recovered in time. McCrae was always accompanied by his horse Bonfire. He brought it over from Canada, and he acquired a dog called Bono. And it's believed that, it's said by McCrae's friends, that after this period of care that he gave all these patients and the exhaustion, that he was never quite the same again. He had lost his debonair and he didn't tell jokes like he did. However, we do have letters that he wrote home to his nephew in Winnipeg and his sister, and they are always full of good humor. He wrote many of the letters as if they were written by Bonfire, and he signed them with a hoof print signed saying Bonfire, his mark. And Bonfire used to report on his master and his dealings. He used to complain about things like when other horses came into his stable, saying, "How would you like it if you had to share your bedroom with 6 other people?" So he used humor like that to describe what he was doing in France. And he worked with the Canadian General Hospital. Unfortunately, in 1918, he contracted pneumonia. Now, one of his things that he did at the time is that he refused any comforts that were available to officers that were not available to the men. And he slept in a tent if the men had to sleep in tents. So at the Canadian General Hospital, he was sleeping in tents and he acquired a chill there. He was ordered into the barracks, but unfortunately he developed pneumonia. He was transferred to hospital and developed meningitis, and he died of meningitis. in January of 1918. This was the period of the great push by the German forces called the Spring Offensive. It was also the beginning of the appearance of the Great Flu, but we don't know if McCrae actually had flu or he had a bacterial infection. He probably died of a bacterial complication of the pneumonia with the meningitis. Since the war, as I said, his poem and the poppy have come to symbolize remembrance, and we do it in a very different way to the way the poppy was used during the First World War. And I think reflection has come to dominate this element of how we see remembrance. Now, what I wanted to tell you about, though, was a little controversy that arose about 10 years ago when a statue was commissioned by the Royal Regiment of Canadian Artillery to commemorate John McCrae, and they wanted to say that he was a gunner. Now, John McCrae was a medical officer, and if he was simultaneously a gunner, he would be in breach of the Geneva Convention. Although this is so long ago, it was felt at the time that this would represent a stain on the reputation not only of John McCrae and of Canada, but also of the medical services, because we actually treasure the Geneva Convention. It occurred at a time when there was the periodic reappearance of an anti-war sentiment. This article written by Robert Fisk in 2013 for The Independent, a newspaper in England, took particular aim at remembrance and the poppy. And it highlighted John McCrae for his criticism. Now, Fisk was not an ordinary journalist. And his commentary was taken very seriously because he had been a war correspondent in many of the difficult spots in the world, in the Middle East for the various wars and in Northern Ireland. And although he was a contrarian, he did carry some weight in his opinions. But this article was vitriolic in its dismissal of our remembrance rituals. And he ended it by including a reference to the mayor of Toronto at the time, which he said was the home of John McCrae, the mayor, who you remember, was having trouble with drugs and other problems with behavior. And he kind of linked McCrae with Rob Ford in his dismissal. Now, this periodic anti-war attack on remembrance has happened before, and it probably will continue to happen. And it's part of our system of reflection, really. But Paul Fussell, who is a veteran of the Second World War, wrote a very important book in 1975 in which he reflected on the Great War and how we remembered it. And he was concerned at this period during the end of the Vietnam War that it had become jingoistic and warmongering, and that there was a lack of reflection that was necessary. And it's interesting that it's war correspondents and veterans who actually bring up this issue for us. So it was an important time for us to look at John McCrae's role, and the Surgeon General convened a group to see how we should respond to this if it did become an issue. So before I tell you what we did, I thought I'd explain to you a little bit about the Geneva Convention. In 1859, at the Battle of Solferino, the injured were left on the field of battle at the conclusion of the fighting. And a businessman, Henry Dunant from Switzerland, was passing by. And it shows you how close civilians could get to the field of a battle in those days, in that he witnessed the suffering of the injured left on the field. And he immediately went to the Italian commander. This battle was fought between the Italians and the Austrians and their allies. And he complained to the Italian commander that the injured were suffering. And he asked if medical care could be given to them. So the commander offered to let him take the Austrian doctors whom he had captured back onto the field. And when the Italian doctors saw that the Austrians were going, they joined them and they looked after the injured on the field. So Henry Dunant went back to Switzerland and he thought that this was a dreadful situation and there was a remedy. And he arranged through his connections for an international conference, which resulted in the First Geneva Convention in 1864. You will note that this was occurring during the American Civil War when an equally brutal many brutal battles were occurring. And there are three main elements to the First Geneva Convention. The first is that relief of the wounded would be supplied without distinction as to nationality. And that meant that a physician or a medical team had to look after the injured regardless of which side they were on. The medical team, their equipment, their transport, and their shelter, and the patient's shelter, was considered inviolable and was therefore not to be included in combat. And the combatants were to know this by a protective sign, which is now very familiar to us, the red cross and the white background. And it was agreed to this symbol in the First Geneva Convention in 1864. So if you flew the Red Cross, you were protected, you were in a non-combatant status. It's a bit like flying a white flag and surrendering. However, likewise, if you use the white flag as a means to then attack the enemy, you would be shown no quarter. Likewise, the Red Cross could not be violated by using it to attack an enemy. And this is why medical personnel are in a non-combatant status and must not take part in offensive activities. They can defend their patients, but they cannot take part in offensive activities. So what was the charge against John McCrae, or what could it have been if it ever arose? And it never really did arise, because those who criticized John McCrae never used these arguments. They used a more simplistic argument that he was belligerent and that his poem was belligerent. But John McCrae did fight in the First World War as in the Boer War as an artillery officer, even though he had graduated as a doctor a couple of years before. He did not go as a physician, he went as an artillery officer. And the reason for this is he had trained as an artillery officer with his father. And he was well known for being very agile with horses and moving guns around as in the militia. And that's why he went as an artillery officer. In the First World War, he offered to join immediately as an artillery officer. But his friends in the artillery and officially, he was told that he was not sufficiently trained and he was completely out of date and would be unable to contribute as an artillery officer. However, he would be valuable as a physician, and therefore he joined as a medical officer in the First World War. There is a recollection regarding his time with the 1st Brigade that he aimed an artillery piece during a visit to the front line. But this is a single reflection and is not remarked on by anybody else, and it occurred many years after in a recollection that was known for other exaggerations. Finally, McCrae was considered to be belligerent in that he was very pro the Canadian side and the Allied side of the war. The Oslers, William and Mrs. Osler, were concerned that he may have influenced Revere Osler to transfer from the Canadian Army Medical Corps to the Canadian Artillery. And Revere Osler was actually killed a year later in that position. And finally, there's the concern regarding the final verse of In Flanders Fields, take up our quarrel with the foe. Well, we were able to deal with the initial concerns very easily. We proved that John McCrae did go to the Boer War as an artillery officer, but that he did not practice as a physician and he did not seek any protections under the Geneva Convention. In the First World War, he was a medical officer, and there is absolutely no evidence that he ever played a role as second in command, although he was friendly, very friendly with the commander of the 1st Brigade. He was never the second in command, and he took no role in either the planning or conduct of offensive actions. The recollection that he might have aimed a gun seems very unlikely, because he was not familiar with the mechanisms that were used at that time for aiming and targeting weapons. And he couldn't just simply come along and say, just move it a couple of degrees up or down or left or right. That'd be a simplistic understanding of how artillery worked in the First World War. Now, we thought that even if we negated those arguments that John McCrae might have breached the Geneva Convention, that wouldn't be sufficient, because if the artillery were going to have a statue of John McCrae in close proximity to other memorials for the artillery, it wouldn't look as well, because it looks offensive that he's taking part of the artillery. And therefore, we wanted to emphasize John McCrae's role as a physician, which is less often emphasized. He's often considered a poet and a soldier. These two letters that I'm showing here played part of that role. I was shown that these letters when I was on a committee in the Royal College of Surgeons and Physicians and Surgeons in Ottawa. And the archivist, Jen Nelson, found these letters and said they were misfiled, and she wondered if they were from John McCrae. She asked me if I thought that was true. And I looked at them and I said, for certain, they're his handwriting. Interestingly, they're signed Jack, which was how John McCrae was known to his friends at the time. And my dear Charlie, to whom he is writing, is probably and almost certainly Charles Martin, a senior physician in McGill, who later became head of medicine and the dean of the medical faculty. And when Martin died, he or his family left some of his memorabilia to the college, including these letters. Now, the letters have some very interesting little features that we can use in our story. One of the letters describes how Bonfire got injured during one of the attacks during the Second Battle of Ypres, and McCrae describes how Bonfire was cared for and how he recovered. In another letter written before the battle, McCrae complains that General Carleton Jones, the Surgeon General, was not listening to him regarding his request to be transferred to the McGill Hospital. And the reason for that is that McCrae had been offered the head of medicine job at the McGill Hospital prior to its arrival in France. And he had gone ahead to be in France and offer his services to the artillery as a regimental medical officer, but he did want to be part of the McGill Hospital, to which he was transferred. It's often said later that he was transferred reluctantly to the number 3 General Hospital, but this letter is absolutely clear that he wanted to go, and he wanted to go long before he was actually transferred. He was transferred towards the end in December 1915. We also thought that maybe we could establish John McCrae's reputation as a physician by having him elected to the Medical Hall of Fame. So we prepared an application for that. I was astounded to discover that this would be the third application that John McCrae made to, or was made on behalf of John McCrae, to the Medical Hall of Fame. The Hall of Fame usually inducts 5 living physicians or scientists in medicine to recognize their contributions. And many of these are of Nobel Prize winning type of caliber. One position is left for somebody who has died every year. And that was the position that we wanted to apply for. John McCrae's previous applications had failed because of their logic that although he was famous, he was not famous as a physician. He was famous as a poet and as a soldier. And our application was to establish him as a Canadian physician of repute. Now, part of that application required the presentation of a curriculum vitae. Well, there's no curriculum vitae for John McCrae, and I'm quite sure the Medical Hall of Fame would have given allowances for those who are applying on behalf of somebody who's dead. But we thought it would be interesting to actually make a curriculum vitae up for John McCrae, and I'm going to share it with you as the last element of this presentation, because it's an interesting way to show you John McCrae's life and to describe him as a physician. Well, as you know, he was born in Guelph, Ontario, and he was born to a farming family. His family, his grandfather had come from Scotland and had farmed in the district, and the farm was continued by his father. His father was also very interested in the militia and commanded the local militia and trained it on his land with cavalry and with artillery. McCrae was a very good student, and he went to Toronto, where he graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in 1894 and then progressed to undertake medicine at Toronto. And in this, he was following his older brother, Tom, who was 2 years ahead of him. And McCrae graduated medicine in 1898. He went on to do postgraduate education and to take examinations, including the membership of the Royal College of Physicians, which made him a certified specialist in internal medicine. He worked at various hospitals in training, including Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where he went for a year, and he was there with his brother Tom, being trained by Sir William Osler, who was very well known at the time, considered probably the premier doctor in North America and maybe in the British Empire. So a man of extraordinary reputation, but very well known to the McCrae brothers. So he was in the inner circle at Johns Hopkins. Following this, he was appointed as an associate in medicine, so a junior doctor in the Royal Victoria Hospital. He had a position in the Montreal General Hospital, where he was a pathologist. He also was a physician in the Infectious Disease Hospital in Montreal. He used his time off as well as he could, and he was an adventurer, and he became the physician to the Governor General's Hudson Bay expedition in 1910, where his repartee as a companion was remarked upon by everybody. He had a private practice in Montreal. In addition to being in the McGill University, he was a visiting professor at Vermont Medical College, where he taught pathology. Towards the end of his military career in the No. 3 Canadian General Hospital, such was his reputation that he was appointed consulting physician to the British Army. This is a highly prestigious position. Very few Canadians have been appointed to it, and such was his reputation that he was appointed. Sir William Osler was also a physician to the British Army. He was a member of many of the associations of the day, including the Royal College of Physicians in London, the Association of American Surgeons, American Physicians, and the Canadian Medical Association. He also took part in livery clubs in Montreal. I thought, though, I'd quickly share with you what is also always part of a CV, and they're the publications. And I think you'll get an understanding for how diverse were his medical interests and how exceptional were his publications. Very few physicians were publishing in those days, and very few in Canada would have had the number of publications that John McCrae had. You can see from these titles, and I don't want you to have to read them all, that he has very diverse interests. He not only does case reports, but he looks at large numbers of patients, 300 agglutination tests against Bacillus coli communis, as it was called in those days. He looked at all sorts of different situations that arose that he would see at autopsy. He was interested in history, and he wrote about a Canadian hospital in the 17th century. He was very interested in the care of children, and he wrote about tuberculosis in children and scarlet fever. And again, instead of just case reports, he would write about very large numbers of patients. This is unique in Canadian reporting at the time. Mostly they were doing individual case reports, but McCrae would report on 325 cases of scarlet fever, 200 autopsies on infants, 850 cases later on scarlet fever. He also became a bit of a specialist in liver pathology. And he was innovative in his care as well. Here's the second last paper there is the subcutaneous injection of oxygen, which to us would sound like an absolutely incorrect thing to do, but he was trying to find ways to deal with gangrene. He wrote several chapters in books, and this also shows the prestige that he had reached as a physician by the time he volunteered for the First World War. He wrote on tropical medicine in a publication called International Clinics, published in Philadelphia. He was asked to write 2 chapters in William Osler's Modern Medicine on the esophagus and on diseases of the kidney. And with George Adami, who was pathologist in McGill and John McCrae's mentor there, he wrote the textbook of pathology that was reissued 2 years later for the 2nd edition, showing its popularity. He undertook experimental research, as I said, and he used the most advanced techniques that were available at that time, mainly looking at bacteria and using agglutination tests to describe some of the host responses to the bacteria. As you know, he wrote poetry, and he frequently published individual poems, and his collected poems were published after his death with an introduction by Alexander MacPhail. So when we made the submission this time, using this information, John McCrae was elected and inducted into the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame. So why is this important today? Really, I mean, we're maybe just hauling over old arguments, and is it worth it? Well, in this period of reflection, we think not only of the past, but we think about the future. And just as there are anti-war sentiments that cyclically come to the fore, actual wars seem to cyclically come to haunt humanity every 25 to 40 years. And there's great concern that we are in the same cycle yet again, where nations are aligning on 2 sides. And this is how it happened before the First World War, how certainly it happened in the Second World War. And there's great concern that the brutality of war keeps getting worse and worse. And the only civilizing influence we seem to have is the medical care that we try to give in the midst of these battles. And that is why the Geneva Convention is so important. Indeed, there's a lot of evidence that irregular forces targeted medical facilities and medical personnel during the Afghan and Iraq conflicts. And during the recent conflicts in which state actors such as Russia in Syria and now more recently in Ukraine have actually been targeting medical facilities, knowing that you can undermine a population if you kill their doctors and destroy their hospitals. So therefore, more than ever, it's necessary for us to defend the role, the non-combatant role of medical physicians. So did John McCrae contravene the Geneva Convention? The answer is an emphatic no. And we agreed to this wording of the plaque accompanying the statue that John McCrae was a poet, gunner, and physician who participated in the First World War. In May 1915, he was moved to write the well-known poem In Flanders Fields, following the death of comrades during the Second Battle of Ypres in Belgium. McCrae's poem came to symbolize the sacrifice of all who fought and died in the First World War and is the inspiration for the poppy as the symbol of remembrance in Canada and other countries. Ruth Abernathy was the artist for this statue. So I'll end with McCrae's poem and look at the last verse. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep though poppies grow in Flanders fields. And it's clear from John McCrae's writing that he's taking a very high level view of his actual experience. He doesn't use the word like take up our quarrel with the Hun, which would have been much more commonly used among writers of that day regarding their enemy. The foe has become not your enemy in battle, but the situations that drive us into war. And the challenge that we have in wearing the poppy in remembrance and in reflecting on all of the sacrifice that has gone before us, the challenge we have is to make this world a better place. So thank you very much for that opportunity to discuss what I think is a very important topic.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Vivian. That was wonderful. I'm actually a little versed with John McCrae because I went to the University of Guelph. So they have his birthplace. I had visited that home because it was near where I lived. But yeah, that was a great presentation. I have a comment in here. It's from Debbie Lashbrook. It says, thank you so much for this amazing presentation and thank you for submitting his application for induction to the Medical Hall of Fame. So well deserved. Thank you for keeping both his memory and the past alive. Today we must remember the past and hope for the best in the future. Excellent. Yeah, that's very eloquently put, Debbie.
Well, nicely put. Thank you. I agree with them.
Yeah. And it looks like we might have another comment, but I actually did have a quick question, or not even a question, more so a statement. Was it odd for that? Like, I'm finding it surprising that both him and his brother studied medicine when they came from like a farming background. Was there any other like medical aspects in their family, or is it just kind of they both just chose that pursuit?
No, that's a very good question, Meredith, and I've never looked into it. Like, what was the inspiration probably for his older brother to become a physician? They both, as far as I know, did it as postgraduate study. So they were familiar with medical students and medical training at the University of Toronto. It is also a sign of the upward mobility of immigrants, starting with getting together, then improving their farming and gradually increasing their wealth and being able to get education. John McCrae and his family did it a long time ago, at the very early phases of modern Canada being made, but it's still a story of today. So I don't think it's unusual, but I don't know any specific inspirations for him. William Osler was an inspiration for him throughout his career, and I'm unaware that he actually might have known about him before he became a medical student.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, yeah, they obviously John McCrae was very successful. We also have another question here. So first it says, thank you for sharing this presentation. What archival resources did you find most useful when researching McCrae's CV?
It's fascinating that McCrae will have both a medical life and a military life, and both are fairly well documented. The publications which really describe his activity are available. They've always been available in libraries, but more recently they've become more available because there's ability to search online, and there are many of the publications can actually be seen online. So we were able to use that. So I did a traditional medical approach to describe his research career. With respect to the military thing, there's an awful lot written about John McCrae, and you have to read it with great caution, because people all have certain vested interests in McCrae. Either they personally knew him, or they have an interest in the history of Canada, the military, or they have a particular way of looking at that history. So I always found it very difficult to look at secondary sources and come up with the truth. So for the what happened in the military, we looked up his military record, and we also looked up the war diaries of the the number 1 brigade of the Canadian Field Artillery, and they're all available now in Ottawa, so you can actually study them as you wish. And I can safely say that we were able to see conclusively that he didn't play any command role in the artillery, and there's absolutely no documented evidence that he ever fired a shot at the enemy, certainly not fired an artillery piece at them.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. I actually just have another question. So you're obviously very passionate about John McCrae, even going so far as to, pursuing having him in the Medical Hall of Fame. So I was curious, what started this passion? What made you so interested in John McCrae?
Well, I mean, you can't be a member of the Medical Corps in the Canadian Armed Forces without being interested in John McCrae, because he's a role model for us all. For me in particular, John McCrae, though, had personal resonance in that, he gave up a stellar medical career at a certain point in his life when he would not be expected to actually go to the front. And then he insisted on not only going to the front, but actually living the life of a soldier at the front, and not accepting any privileges that he might have been able to get as a medical officer and through his contacts. And that rings very true to me. However, in medicine and in the military, I found that you can't actually work unless you think about those who did the jobs, the same jobs that you're doing, but they did them before you, whose shoes you filled. And it's just part of the way doctors work, that we are doing jobs that were done by other people. And when I read the work of people like John McCrae, I can see the trouble, the challenges that he faced. And I know the equipment that he had at the time, and I can see his thought process in trying to deal with the medical issues. And that those thought processes are very familiar to all of us practicing today. So it's natural to look back at this history and these people.
Yeah, that's that's great. And as Debbie had mentioned before, it's amazing that you kind of with your colleagues worked together to make sure that he was inducted, because it's it's an like a deserved position for him to be inducted in the Medical Hall of Fame. So thank you for doing that. And then
There is one thing I didn't
yeah,
mention on my slide. It said you could see play the video. So anybody who's interested, if they just look up John McCrae at the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame, they have a very nice brief video that summarizes his life and especially his life as a physician, which is slightly different to the emphasis that we traditionally get about John McCrae as a soldier and a poet.
yeah, and I think and it's great to be able to know both sides, because obviously
Exactly.
medical was a huge part of his life, right? So that would be awesome. I'll definitely be checking that out today. But yes, on behalf of all of us here and the Simcoe County Museum, I would like to thank you, Vivian. This was a great presentation. It was lovely learning about John McCrae and learning more about him. We all know him as the poet, but not maybe so much as the doctor, and discovering how important he was. So thank you so much.
Well, it's been a great pleasure, and thank you for having me. I look forward to listening to the next presentations occurring next week and the week after. So
Yes,
thank you, Meredith.
perfect. Thank you so much. Yes, and please feel free to join us every Thursday at 1 o'clock. We will be having presentations with a variety of topics. We'll be talking about the liberation of Netherlands, the shipbuilding, the wooden shipbuilding industry, and we'll even be talking about some local soldiers and how their mothers memorialized them in their local legion. So make sure to come back and join us. As I said, it's every Thursday for the month of November at 1 o'clock. Thank you so much. And Vivian, thank you once again.